Hello and welcome back to Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers, the podcast devoted to exploring the frontiers of psychedelic medicine and what it takes to cultivate a healthy mind, body, and spirit. I'm Dr. Steve Thayer, and today my co-host, Dr. Reid Robison, and I discuss how to navigate a crisis of religious faith. This is sometimes called faith deconstruction, and it's a challenging and sometimes traumatic transition for a person to make. We understand that you, our listeners, come from a variety of religious backgrounds and have diverse spiritual beliefs. Some of what Reid and I talk about in this episode might be triggering. You might feel seen, you might feel validated, defensive, angry, or something else entirely. All your reactions are welcome. Reid and I share our personal experiences with religious faith deconstruction and what it's like to help clients through this process. We discuss the role psychedelic experiences play in that process for some. Please know that our intent is not to offend, and we hope that this episode helps those who need to hear it. Quick plug for the unique training opportunities that Numinous has for mental health practitioners to develop an expertise in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. These courses are carefully crafted by Numinous professionals like myself and Reid and Joe and others, and they offer high-quality learning experiences. So if you'd like to learn more about these trainings, you can find the link in the show notes below, or you can visit numinous.com/training. We've had some wonderful reviews posted on the show lately on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to support the show, you can leave a review. You can also rate the show, you can subscribe to the show, and of course, share an episode that you love with someone that you love. Thanks for listening. Reid, welcome back to podcast Dimensional Space. I love stepping into this pocket of dimensional space every once in a while and talking to you about cool stuff.
Podcast Dimensional Space.
Trademark.
I like the idea of dimensions.
Yeah, me too.
Channels of consciousness. We're in the podcast channel of consciousness right now.
Yeah.
Where there is nothing outside of this table we sit at.
Nothing except the eternal now that you and I inhabit. So we invite you listeners to join us in this moment of the eternal now. We're actually going to tackle a topic that could be fairly difficult for some of you to listen to us talk about. I don't want to make too many assumptions, but there's a reason there's a reason we have this adage that we don't talk about religion and politics among polite company, because those things are connected to our sense of self. They're connected to our moral view of human behavior and society. They're connected to our ontological realities, like what we think we are and who we are and where we've been and where we're going. They're big deals. Goes without saying, but I'm saying it anyway. However, this is a topic I think about a lot. The topic being religious faith transition, religious faith deconstruction, a crisis of religious faith. It goes by many terms. But a lot of my clients have struggled significantly as they go through things like this. And I myself have gone through quite a journey when it comes to my personal religious faith. So I thought it might be useful to a lot of our listeners. I'll make the disclaimer that, Reid and I are going to be talking from personal experience. We'll be talking from an aggregated experience of some of the clients that we've worked with. And there's no one way to do this. There's no one way to believe. There's no one way to navigate changes in belief. So if you notice that we are saying things that you don't agree with, or we're saying things that maybe offend you a bit, please know our intent is to be kind, is to be as considerate as possible, as is possible for us in this moment when we talk about these sensitive topics. And so please grant us that grace as we try to normalize some things for people. And hopefully for those of you who've struggled, this will help you feel seen. And for those of you who know people who struggle, this will help you help them feel seen.
In fact, it's a good spoiler alert coming out of your trigger warning in that, one of the things we hope to convey is the need to be a non-judgmental, compassionate, empathetic presence for other people, especially when going through a faith transition, faith crisis, faith expansion. You can call it all sorts of things, because those can be dark nights of the soul, and for reasons we'll talk about. And one of the big things someone needs in that is to not feel so alone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we're going to get to all this. Just to set the stage a little bit, though, most of the survey data that I looked at around religious faith suggests that there's a trend in the Western world of people, especially people kind of Gen X down, to, when asked, are you affiliated with any particular religion, to say none. No, I'm not. They call them the nuns, as in the no religious affiliation.
I thought you were talking about Catholic nuns at first when you told me about this.
The nuns. Yeah, they call them the NONEs, the nuns.
You don't see the nuns around here very often.
No, we don't. Around here being Utah, we see a lot of geese outside of our window. Geese have come back, which is pleasant, although they crap all over the place. Sorry about the tangent. Anyway, so yeah, there's this growing group of people, and most of them younger, that might describe themselves as spiritual, but they do not affiliate with any particular organized religion. The last stat I looked up is nuns accounted for 16% of surveyed people in 2007, 29% of surveyed people in 2021.
Wait, no
religious affiliation.
Okay, because now I'm having a crisis of my own, because I read a Gallup poll statistic yesterday this is from 2020, and Gallup does pretty decent polls. I guess they're poll people. They said that for the first time ever, the percent of Americans not identifying as a member of a certain religion, must be how they asked the question, surpassed 50%.
Yeah. Could be how they asked the question. It could be the specific people polled, which regions of the country. The other one I was citing was a Pew poll, but
I guess they're pretty good at polls too.
Yeah. I think the consensus among pollsters probably is that there's at least a trend.
Yeah, I think we can feel it too. I don't know, do you feel it in the air right now?
Oh, right now it's buzzing. Buzzing in the air. I can smell it.
But look at the generational differences in, when I look at it in my own family, it's real, it's there, and I think it mirrors what's happening in the generations out there in the world, or especially in the Western world, around questioning, around finding one's own path, around seeking alternate ways of communing with the divine.
Yeah. Not only alternate ways of communing with the divine and the questioning piece. I think there's probably a general skepticism in institutions generally.
Yeah.
I think you see in the younger generations, I see this in my own kids, just they don't take institutions at face value. That I should trust institutions, I should trust adults, certain adults. They have a very skeptical, open, questioning mindset. So not taking things for granted or at face value seems to be typical of the psyche of the younger generations. Not speaking as if I'm super old. I turned 40 in 2 days. But
happy birthday to Steve. Yay. By the time this episode drops, he'll be 40.
I'll be over the hill and on my way down.
Wait a second. Having hit 40, I think that signals a new awesome chapter.
I think so too. I'm just being a little playful. I'm really excited for my 40s and my 50s. I'm going to make them the best decades yet.
Steve all grown up.
Cool. So yeah, we have this
trend,
this new zeitgeist, if I can use an obnoxious word. But with that, with the questioning and with the transitioning, comes the potential for a lot of distress, a lot of pain.
Yeah.
I can certainly speak from my own experience growing up. We've talked about it many times on the show, that grew up in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And in so many really important ways, that worked for me so well.
The Mormons,
yeah,
if you don't know what the long way of saying Mormons is.
Right. Yeah, I grew up in a community in Utah where just about all of my neighbors were members of the church. So I got to, on Sundays, go and see all my neighbors. And there was a lot of young kids because, as Mormons are wont to do, they reproduce a lot. So I got to have a lot of peers. And it was nice to be in a community where we sort of felt safe in the sense that the assumption being that we all sort of believed in the same important things, similar values. And we were there to support each other. And, I'd show up midweek for activities for the youth, the teenagers. I had several people I could look up to outside of my own family. And in addition to my wonderful parents, I could look up to other adults in the community for guidance. I got to do lots of cool stuff in Boy Scouts, which was affiliated with the church. So growing up in the church was actually really, really cool, which made my eventual departure from the organized faith pretty painful.
Yeah, makes it almost harder.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, especially in a homogenous community where you not only lose your identity in some ways and fear losing family, community, respect from others, and all sorts of things. People even fear what happens to them professionally when they go through faith transitions.
Yeah, Reid, those are some great examples of what's at stake for people when they go through faith transitions, especially if you're transitioning in a faith that's high demand. High demand religions being religions that require a lot from you. They require a tithe, they require your income, they require lots of time commitment.
Yeah, volunteerism of giving talks or taking on responsibilities, teaching.
And that creates a more cohesive group. It's something that's at play in cults. So there's some dynamics there that work psychologically to keep people committed to an organization. But it's also at play in organizations that aren't cults, that just simply work well. It's a way to build cohesion and commitment. But that's just a phenomenon that can be used for good or for ill.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember, speaking of what's at stake, I remember having lunch with a therapist friend years ago. Something that I'll never forget, though, because it was a therapist in Utah going through her own faith crisis. And when she got the courage to speak about it to her parents, her family, that like, I'm really struggling with believing this religious belief that I was born into. And this is not an uncommon experience, as shocking as it may seem, as like her dad said something like, this is as if I've lost a child. Like, it would be better if my child died than went like against a religion. Like, and it sounds shocking, but like generationally and religiously not that surprising. Like, we may know people like that. And what ensued for her was not only a dark night of the soul, but feeling for the first time ever like she felt like it would be less painful to be dead than alive in that. So yeah, I got the chills just talking about it because of what's like emotionally at stake for people.
Yeah. Yeah, and surely there are, plenty of people within a church like the Mormon Church who would not have reacted that way to their kid.
Yeah,
right?
thankfully.
So we're not trying to make these blanket statements.
No.
So if you're in a church and you're having a defensive thought right now, just know, like, this was an example of what does happen. It doesn't happen to everybody or all the time. But it's a great example of those high stakes for some people.
Yeah, yeah. And that wasn't my experience or yours, even though it was really hard. And all those little deaths that you experience in a faith transition are at play in one way or another. But I think a big difference is how you're held through it. And if you have people you can talk to, or tools and practices in yourself to rely on so you don't get absolutely crushed or engulfed by this some of these fears.
Right. Yeah, so great example of what's at stake for a lot of people, the potential for rejection by the people that matter most to them, their family, just like being disowned practically, heavily criticized, people making assumptions about your morality. It's not uncommon for people to try to make sense of why a loved one might leave their religious faith and say, oh, they just can't handle the rules, or they want to go and be sinful. They want to cut loose and do the things they're not supposed to.
That one, I think, hits a button in me because I experienced it a little bit. Like when I was going from being an active member of the same church as you to like questioning and then speaking up about it and choosing my own path. One of the things that was especially difficult was when like the leaders of the local church kind of viewed me as sick or struggling, like, let us pray for him. Not in a way of like, let's pray for everyone. Everyone needs a little prayer, which my parents actually thankfully responded that way. They're like, we're going to pray for you, and it's out of love and all that. But to hear it like, oh, I'm sorry to hear like a church leader say, sorry to hear your dad is struggling. And I was like, wait a second. I'm expanding my worldview. I'm seeking, I'm doing it in like the best integrity to myself that I can, and it hurt.
Yeah. Yeah. It's super painful because you're so vulnerable in that moment, in that phase, in that dark night of the soul, that the last thing you need is judgment and rejection.
Mm-hmm.
And I do want to extend some compassion to people who are quote unquote praying for you, because a lot of them probably were acting out of love. At least they thought they were. Like here we have somebody we care about that's straying. To stray from the faith of certain religions is terrifying. Meaning it's terrifying to know that somebody you love is straying from the faith, because the implications are that they might lose out on eternal life. They might burn in hell. Like depending on the religious ideology or the doctrine, they might go to hell. They might not be able to be with you in the afterlife. So when family members sort of freak out about their family member having a religious faith crisis or transitioning out, a lot of time that freak out is understandable. And it's not just like, oh, you're a dogmatic jerk who wants to keep me in a cult. Sometimes it's that, but I would say not all the time.
Yeah. No, I'm glad you brought that up, because I see it now, like from my current point on the other side of that, and I see the love that was underneath it. And I bring it up as an example because it can be so even accidentally pernicious to convey some of these like kind of traditionally passed on human follies or misunderstandings that you may not even know how much it's hurting someone to pass judgment instead of understanding and compassion.
Yeah, it's a great story to, I guess, leverage into some advice, and we'll dip back in and out of pro tips here. But if you want to support a loved one who's going through religious faith transition or deconstruction, showing up in a loving, non-judgmental way is paramount. And that might mean reserving some of your questions, right? Like it's, you might want to ask, well, like, are you doing all this stuff that we're supposed to do to keep our faith? Like, have the assumption that you're sick, right? That you're doing something wrong.
You stopped reading the scriptures or whatever.
You stopped praying,
yeah.
You stopped serving, you stopped doing the things
These
you're supposed to do.
assumptions that can be really hurtful. Yeah.
Especially hurtful because certainly this was true. I'll speak from my own experience. I didn't know many people who took religion more seriously than I did. And one of my biggest, I guess my first big crisis of faith occurred when I was a Mormon missionary. So I was actually full-time, dedicated my entire life for 2 years to preaching the gospel according to the LDS church, trying to recruit, baptize people. So to have that happen out there and have people question my sincerity or question how serious I was taking my religious faith was super painful. Also offensive. Like, how dare you? But
how dare you?
Yeah, but really painful too.
Yeah. I mean, to love someone is to be generous in your interpretation of their actions and behavior, right? We've said that before. I'm quoting Alain de Botton, philosopher. And, a loving stance is to seek first to understand instead of jumping to conclusions. And it's safest just to assume that we are all trying our best to figure it out. No one has all the answers. And if someone is in a faith crisis, it's not for lack of trying to figure out their faith that they ended up there, as a general rule, right?
Right. Yeah. Not for lack of trying. And I think that cutting each other slack, giving each other the benefit of the doubt can go both ways for the two parties that we're sort of describing here. So yeah, show up with love, show up with compassion. And to riff a little bit on what you said, Reid, yes, none of us really have it all figured out. If you think you do, send me an email. I'd love to know what the secrets of the universe are.
Yeah.
But I think if you can allow yourself to entertain the possibility that your loved one, whether they are the people who are staying in a faith that you're leaving, or the ones that are leaving a faith that you're staying in, that their path is different and that's okay, then that'll help you get pretty far to this compassionate place we're talking about. We all have different paths, and that's tough for people to do when part of their religious doctrine is, this is the way, this is the truth, this is God's revealed truth, and if don't believe in this or dedicate your life to this, then you've got it wrong. I understand that's a big challenge. That's a big ask for people who believe those things, but man, it goes a long way.
There was a TEDx talk that I sent you the other night, and I don't remember his name right now, but it was a Billings, Montana TEDx talk where the gentleman spoke about his faith crisis and transition, growing up as a Mormon in Montana with a gay son, and to see how the church kind of rules at the time would make life so hard for his son. And, understandably, there was this faith crisis that ensued, but what got him out of a 3-month dark night of the soul, I like how he put it, was the ministry of presence, of grace and presence. Like, he found someone who was just able to listen, to hold him in his dark night, and so he didn't feel alone in it.
And I think he mentions in the talk that that's a Brene Brown thing, the ministry of grace and presence. Like, when in doubt, at least you can give that.
Yeah.
As you were talking, I looked it up. Thriving and Building Community After a Faith Crisis by Anthony Miller. It was a TEDx Billings talk.
Maybe it'll make it into the show notes.
Who knows? You'll have to look at the show notes to find out, folks. Yeah, but that is the thing. That is the key. Maybe we can talk a bit more about what people tend to go through as they are deconstructing their faith, or shifting in their faith journey. One thing I've noticed in myself, but also in my clients, is a disconnection from their gut, or a mistrust of their feelings. This especially happens when people are used to sort of externalizing authority. So if they have a decision to make, or like, especially if it's a big decision, they need to pray about it and consult God. They need to consult the scriptures. They need to consult the prophets. Especially the pray about it thing, because if your relationship to the divine is kind of like a wish granting genie, where you ask for things and then you're paying attention to what in some churches is called like the Holy Spirit, or the still small voice, these subtle feelings, or maybe it's an audible voice in your head, or a general impression. For people who are very, very anxious, that can be really difficult.
Oh yeah.
Really difficult to discern, like, is this just my own thinking? Is this Satan trying to deceive me? Is this really from God? And you're trying to have this flow chart of how you can trust what's going on in your mind and in your heart.
An emotion, premonition of the Holy Spirit, a feeling, dopamine, or whatever it may be.
Yeah. Is it just, did I eat something? So, and maybe there are some of you who are listening that totally have this figured out for you, but I'm just saying there are people who don't.
Yeah.
And so when they leave their church and they're playing around with what to believe now, learning to trust their intuition, learning to get in touch with what we've called like the core self, or the inner healing intelligence, or whatever, can be fraught with anxiety.
Yeah, it's I've heard this metaphor of a faith transition like a caterpillar going to a butterfly or chrysalis, and especially emphasizing the fact that it is not glamorous what's going on inside, as like yourself digesting during this transformation, this gory transformation popping out of one's own skin. You got to have compassion and understanding for that, because your typical, by definition, your faith crisis puts all that in question, like your channel for answers, your worldview, your intuition. You have to kind of lose and find again many of those things for many people.
Yeah, it feels like a puzzle that breaks, but then the shape of the pieces change. Like you're not reassembling that puzzle just the way it was. People talk about existential crisis, or I would add ontological and epistemological crises. Like not only a crisis of who am I, what does my existence mean, but what am I? Where did I come from? And then how do I know? How do I know the truth? How do I get access to knowledge if some of the things I used to believe, I no longer believe in relative to those things? So it can feel like a total dissolving. You're being digested by, I guess, the universe is the chrysalis here, but whatever it is. And I love the TEDx talk that you referenced because, he is so raw and weeps in that talk and is amazingly vulnerable at just the level of pain that this dissolving process involves, and drives, as you noted about your friend, some people to suicidal thoughts. Like, this is too painful. I can't handle this.
He even mentioned that in his talk. I was listening on my way home from here yesterday after, I think, just before I sent it to you, and it was interesting. I think we both shed a tear or two while listening, but you know how funny it is to cry while driving. I don't know if that's your experience, but and then I'm at a stoplight looking over and be like, do they know I was just bawling over here to a TEDx talk? But the part where he talks about how painful it was and that he wished in a moment to just stop breathing, and not even his like own supportive, loving spouse could like get into that pain with him in that moment.
Yeah, such a powerful message. I mean, part of his message is about finding community that you talked about a second ago, but that it's so important for those of us going through this, or those of us supporting people going through this, to find community that will have that ministry of loving presence. You can find communities online, but the feeling that you are uniquely bad or broken or terrible or lost, and that there's no one can understand you. I mean, this goes for all kinds of things, even outside of religious faith deconstruction. That feeling is hell, right? It's hell in your heart.
It's like, I was listening to this live stream the other day by, do you know the spiritual teacher Adyashanti? He's super wise, Buddhist teacher. And he was he was doing a Q&A at his Sangha and streaming live on YouTube or something. And someone asked, like, they had an awakening experience, and why was it accompanied by so much panic? And it made me think of this topic because, or even the whole Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers podcast title ties into it. Like, when we go from one state of consciousness to another, like the change in that, especially without the ability and the container to surrender and ride it, like without fear, can be extremely frightening. And the ego, understandably, is like, things are changing, alert, 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 and can try and grasp onto the old self, and you might end up in full like panic mode.
Yeah, we did an episode a long time ago, didn't we, about spiritual emergencies?
Yeah.
Reminds me of that concept. And emergency, and also in the sense of the word, like something emerging.
That was a good one. I think it was with Hannah when we were down in the Springville, Utah office.
Yeah, long time ago.
Yeah, but it's understandable that it's a scary. Transitions are scary, or and there's uncertainty that we're wired to kind of worry about. And in fact, that's, I think, one of the reasons religious practices, religious organizations, and worship rituals exist, is because there's so much uncertainty and chaos in life, and like we find comfort in the order. So we come together in communal ways sometimes to do something that's a little more orderly, like a familiar ritual. It could be like sitting around the dinner table after a crazy day with one's family, but it could be going to church on Sunday and singing together or praying together that punctuates the chaos with this orderly practice that soothes the nervous system and maybe the soul to a certain extent. But then the problem people run into is there are no perfect humans out there, and every religious organization is full of imperfect humans, right? Because we all are. So guaranteed, you stay in an organization of humans of any kind long enough, you will get perturbed. Like we bump into each other as humans, and many people, take issue with that and get really fired up about religions because of that. But it happens. Doesn't matter if you're Mormon or in a Zen Sangha that, the guru falls into some temptations or pitfalls of his or her own. It's just like that happens out there, and it's it's what's underneath a lot of people's faith crisis, or what kind of triggers it sometimes.
Yeah. I mean, we see the most egregious examples of these. We see people being abused by those who are in power within the organization, abused psychologically, sexually, financially, physically. And there's a lot of trauma that people experience within the structure of a religious organization. To the point that you're making, like that happens anytime people get together, anytime there is a community. And I heard an evolutionary biologist make the argument that he thought that that evolution, the natural selection, selected for religious faith because of the reasons you talked about, like the desire for certainty, the desire for community, that ritual.
The strength in numbers too.
Yeah, for sure. But what ritual gives us is what would be the term from? It's selection pressure selected for ritual because ritual helps us survive as groups.
Yeah.
But yeah, back to the trauma point. It's we talked so much about how people feel isolated and like they're broken sometimes when they're leaving their religious faith, going through a transition. And that is a recipe for disaster when you've been traumatized, right? When you're traumatized, you need validation, you need safety, so that you can go through the hard work of processing that trauma. And that's often not what people are getting. Sometimes in the worst set of circumstances, they're getting victim blamed, they're getting questioned about what really happened. And even if it wasn't an event, I mentioned earlier about how my upbringing in the church was really, really great. I want to recognize that it tends to be really, really great for white dudes. Like at least the church I grew up in, it can be great for all kinds of people, but it tends to be pretty good given the hierarchical structure of it and the fact that it was an American founded religion. Pretty great for people who look like me.
It would not have been great if you were like fill in the blanks, like LGBTQ plus, right? Like especially a certain time in the church's evolution, or females have a different experience, like in like very conservative religious upbringings as well. And so, yeah, while I think it's really important to acknowledge both sides, that there can be pluses and minuses, and it can be very traumatizing for some and not for others. And it's about just extending that understanding and compassion. But I appreciate the trauma metaphor having like, or the pain metaphor. After something is painful, say a traumatic incident from a psychological lens, we wall off that part of us or that part of life to protect it for a time. And then the healing work is in when it's safe to do so, like reconnecting with the lost parts of oneself. And in the faith crisis example, it might be your spirituality, your connection with God. You might wall it off, understandably, for a short time or a long time. And some people can stay stuck in that, understandably, for quite some time because of a painful experience they had. And it's another thing I've been thinking a lot about lately, is just the journey back from that.
Yeah, it's something I witnessed in a clinical trial participant who was doing a psilocybin clinical trial. where, this person had left a religious institution, landed somewhere that where you're describing, very materialist, reductionist, atheist. We're just meat puppets that eventually die and go back to the earth.
Mm-hmm.
And their experience on psilocybin was intensely spiritual, was mystical. This person felt a connection to what they used to feel like was the divine. And it showed up in true psilocybin fashion as some kind of trippy purple spirit thing floating around, but the connection, the phenomenology, the experience of it was, this is something durable, something eternal, something that carries love for me and that has wisdom. So they didn't end their psilocybin experience signing up for church again, but it reconnected them to the possibility that they don't have it all figured out, that there is a great mystery out there, that there's more to it than we understand, and that maybe there's more to us than just being, like I teased about, just being meat puppets.
Because it's worth checking that in oneself, is like when you've been in an organization, say a religion, where something has really perturbed you or something isn't sitting right, and you make the decision to leave it. It's worth looking at, like, you gotta trust and honor that, and then also look at kind of the reasons. Are you stuck in a state of like resentment or hatred towards a person in that, or towards the organization? And some people have been able to find their way back to some kind of communal practice by doing, working on the narrative of what happened in that regard, like not discounting any of the traumas or abuses people have experienced, especially in these religious situations. It's just tragic. But I do notice that some people who leave stay bitter for a very long time, even if it's because someone said something that pushed a button in them, when they might be able to let some of that go, knowing that, like we were saying, like, people can't be perfect. Love can be, religions can't be perfect, but like maybe a faith or maybe a loving kind of pursuit can be.
I'm glad you brought that up, Reid. I'm glad you brought up the bitterness, the pain. Sometimes, and this is true of that emotion, regardless of where it's pointed, that there are some things that we hold on to really at our own peril, our own detriment.
Yeah.
And resentment and bitterness and hostility and anger are one of those. It's a poison that you're taking yourself when you hold on to it. I know it's hard, and it is, when we don't use phrases like "get over it" or "get past it" when we're talking about something like this, of course.
No.
But we do want to at least draw attention to the fact that if you hold on to the resentment and the bitterness and the pain in this way, it could prevent you from certainly just feeling better, but also from finding the uniqueness of your new path. If your new identity is X something, as opposed to whatever beautiful uniqueness you are, then it might keep you a little too close to the bitterness.
Yeah, and I've seen people bounce around after leaving, say, the religion or faith of their upbringing and becoming disillusioned because of the imperfect stuff there. Understandably, they leave and they might find something else, like Sufism or like Hinduism, or
their local psychedelic journey group.
Yeah,
right?
and then you have a local psychedelic journey group leader who you realize turns out to be a creeper or something like that. And of course you leave that too, but there is a guarantee that if you stay in a human group long enough, it will perturb you, trigger you. And part of that, like we talk about in conscious committed partnerships, like we trigger each other, that shows us our work. Sometimes we bounce around from therapists, sometimes we bounce around from spiritual paths because we're not willing to face the part of it that's in ourself.
What would you tell somebody who's listening to you right now and is coming to the realization that maybe they're doing that? what might we offer in terms of, I don't know, helpful tips?
Yeah, it's a good question and a tricky one to answer, but in the spirit of understanding that like humans aren't perfect and therefore religions and their rules are not, but there is beauty in the finding a path and pursuing it deeply. Like as long as you keep your discernment radar on and like you're not affiliating with things if they're really inconsistent with your values or how people are being treated, you do have to stick with something long enough to go deep enough to access some parts of this like spirituality we're talking about. Like I believe that enlightenment is following something to the end. Like enlightenment runs deep. And when we bounce around, we stay surface level there. You don't know really why people in Hinduism are chanting for a few hours until you've tried that and tried it enough that you can experience what devotional chanting is like to feel God in that way, right? And you do need to stick to something with discernment for long enough, whatever your path is.
Yeah, I like that. You mentioned values. It's not uncommon for us to talk about values in therapy, that to live a quote unquote good life or a mentally healthy life is one that is calibrated to your values. When I talk about values in therapy, a lot of my clients, it's hard for a lot of my clients, especially those who are going through religious faith transitions, because they don't know. They don't know what their values are now. And there's a little bit of a danger of throwing some babies out with the bathwater. Sometimes I witness kind of a post high demand religion rumspringa, or like a delayed adolescence where all of a sudden, all those rules I was compelled to follow being raised in this religion, I don't have to follow those rules anymore. And then people find themselves in dire straits, either with substances or screwing up relationships or whatever. So I like the discernment that you're talking about, following something through. Like take a hard look at what aligns with your values and maybe play around with a few. And values are things like, I want to behave in a way that is consistent with being loving. I want to behave in a way that's consistent with being honest, with having integrity. Values aren't goals. They're not things you check off a list necessarily. I've used many times on here the metaphor of us being instruments that fall out of tune and need to be put back in tune. When we are living a life that's consistent with our values, we are a well-tuned instrument that sounds good to us and harmonizes with others in our life who are also living a life consistent with their values.
Yeah, and you got to find the others sometimes to commune with, like with some of those same values or that resonate in the same way with the tuning of your instrument.
Right.
Because there is power in that. Like there is power in like communing with the sacred together, that we've seen. And there is power in connecting with your own spirituality, whatever that means.
Whatever that means. Allow it to be confusing for a while. Allow it to be unclear. For me personally, learning to embrace what I called a second ago the great mystery, the lack of certainty, and that is the nature of my existence right now. Learning to embrace it and accept it has been tremendously healing for me. It's really contributed to my peace of mind. Coming from a place where I was just desperate to know what the truth was, desperate to know exactly what I was supposed to do so that I could like score all the eternal points, make it to the highest degree of highest kingdom or whatever, or just to know that I was doing the right thing. And there was probably some OCD, some obsessiveness mixed in there a little bit, as there often is with people who go through this. Instead of finding all the answers, letting go of my attachment to finding all the answers was the answer. No,
I love that and experienced it myself. At one point, I had to give up the search for answers or just make a commitment to myself or settle into a place of just living the question. And it's okay. There's no deadline to figure these out. And that can turn existential angst into like a beautiful, long-standing pursuit. Yeah, or practice.
Mm-hmm. It is a practice. Certainly is a practice for me, like returning to that belief, that commitment to allowing myself not to have all the answers and that being okay.
Mm-hmm.
And instead, as we said before, trying to calibrate my life, live my life in a way that's consistent with the values that I'm playing around with now, knowing that it's okay if they change too. And, when people ask questions like, but what about what happens after you die? Aren't you concerned about, your eternal soul? Well, yeah, of course I am. But I don't pretend to know exactly what I'm supposed to do, or even if there is a supposed to. I think, and this is what my wife used to tell my kids when my wife was still in the church and I was not, when they'd get concerned about me, because some people at church would be like, oh, what's wrong with your dad? And their experience of dad was not some kind of crazy heathen. Their experience of dad was like, still dad, nice guy, loves us, he's around. So my wife would tell them, so dad, right? He's a good dad, he's a good guy. Yeah. Do you think that if we got to the afterlife, that a loving God would like send dad to hell, or he would separate dad from us?
Rejected. Yeah.
And they're like, no, that doesn't jive with my understanding of a loving God. And she's like, okay.
There you go.
So if there is a God, or if we are, if our relationship to God is one of judgment, meaning that God's going to weigh our actions, I choose to believe, because I don't have compelling evidence to believe otherwise, that this being that's supposed to love us unconditionally is going to see my heart. And I feel like my heart's in the right place.
And be infinitely understanding to someone's circumstances that put them where they're at, whether they're like born in a place that doesn't have any kind of spiritual practices in their upbringing, and they have to, find that in their own way at their own time, or whether it's people who are born into a religion and just find their own path up that mountain another way.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's also, I'm also open to the possibility that the being that created us in the universe is a malevolent demon and like hell awaits us all. Regardless, I'm still going to just keep doing the best I can. And that's what I keep trying to do is, given my set of circumstances now, who I am, what I care about, I will just keep doing the best I can. And for that's going to be enough. It has to be enough because it's the best I can.
Yeah, I love that. I love the ideas that kindness is a religion of its own, and a beautiful one. And just what matters is how we treat each other, right? On the topic of faith, some of what we've been discussing reminds me of the concept of surrender. Like I just remember an Alan Watts quote that said, "Faith is a state of total let go." And like there is that part of a spiritual practice that is involves surrender. You even hear about it in Christianity or Mormon doctrine of like putting your ego, your will on an altar. And that can be a pitfall that one could fall into, and without that discernment and everything else, and your own intuition, or it can be a beautiful surrender practice of submitting to something greater than yourself. I
remember the phrase "yield your heart unto God." Phrase that comes from some LDS scripture. And I think it syncs up with kind of what you're talking about, that this concept of releasing control is not unique certainly not to Christian theology, certainly present all over in Buddhist ideologies and in some non-religious secular philosophies. It seems to be a really important thing that is just a feature of managing human consciousness and how it grinds to a halt or causes us to suffer. This concept of acceptance and surrender, releasing attachments to things. Yeah, and it shows up in all religious schools of thought in one way or another, like that surrendering the will, the let go leap of faith, or the self-emptying, or even in like Ram Dass's becoming nobody, or like losing oneself to find oneself. Yeah, it seems to be a universal principle.
Yeah, and one that comes in handy in psychedelic journeying too, as a
Sure
matter of fact.
does. Sure does.
Yeah, I mean, there are parallels. Like, you go on a psychedelic journey, and it's like a little hero's journey in and of itself. And a lot of parallels to our spiritual paths and practices.
One thing I will say about psychedelics, and the clients that I've worked with that are going through this, for some of them, psychedelics precipitated their religious faith transition. For some of them, psychedelics were incredibly helpful and they were already on the path. For some of them, psychedelics, like I described earlier with my example from the clinical trial, helped them find their way back to a connection with the divine. Like we've often talked about, these are tools, perhaps non-specific amplifiers, perhaps something that gives us what we need when we need it.
Things that can occasion a mystical or spiritual experience, whatever that is for you.
Yeah.
A meaningful experience.
And I brought it up because I know there are people out there that might say, oh, don't do those mushrooms. They're going to make you stop believing. Or don't do those mushrooms. They're going to make you start believing.
Yeah.
So yeah, just trying to be thoughtful. And a couple of things that I also wanted to point out that people tend to experience as they're going through this stuff. Your old conditioning will still be there. So let's say you've made a decision and you have changed the way you believe and you've left your organized religion that you were, especially if you were brought up in it. Simply making that decision cognitively that you no longer believe in X, Y, or Z isn't going to remove the conditioning. It's not going to necessarily remove the doubt in yourself or the, as I said before, the externalization of authority. I know some people who were raised in really, really conservative religions that were conservative around sex and around arousal and around eroticism. Even though in their mind the gloves are off now and they can really embody their sexual selves, there's still a lot of like visceral aversion to certain things sexually.
Deeply ingrained.
Yeah. So I want to just name that, express, and normalize that, and maybe give a little hope that it can change and that you can do targeted, directed work on things like that, and it can help.
Yeah, and it takes time. Like you're not going to radically in a night change all of that deeply ingrained conditioning or even beliefs like will creep back in, and it is important to take that long view of the healing journey and the spiritual growth path. Like we're not going to figure these out on any kind of agenda or timeline, or at all for that matter.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't have everything figured out.
Yeah, and you can change your mind at any time. Just because you have a faith crisis or faith transformation doesn't mean you can't stay in your faith you were raised into with a new understanding, and it doesn't mean you have to stay, right? Like that's important to remember, is like the complete autonomy with the understanding that some people's situation in family and community, there are some serious losses if they leave, and that makes it extra scary. But in the end, there are many people who have been able to get to the other side of that or find some support along the way that helps them work through those fears and real concerns.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. We started by talking about the nuns, not the nuns, but the nuns, and that I think in addition to that sort of secularization of Western society, there are people who stay in their religious, in their religions, who become nuanced believers. Who I think there's changes within the umbrella of a lot of old religious faiths, and maybe there are some of you who are listening that views that as a problem in and of itself, that you're more of a fundamentalist or a traditionalist, and that's okay too. I guess in true Reid and Steve fashion, we're trying to be really diplomatic and really compassionate and trying to normalize and not step on toes. I'm sure we've stepped on some toes in our conversation today. But no, we please know that we picked this topic out of love. Like for me, this is something that really matters to me personally. And I know it matters to a lot of my friends and family members, and I know it matters to a lot of you out there listening. So we didn't talk about this to upset people necessarily, although triggers are great friends to follow, as Reid likes to say. But to normalize and to just help draw awareness to this path, because it's a path that many of us walk that can be really, really difficult.
Yeah, I think I've mentioned to you this friend of mine who used to be also a meditation teacher of mine named Thomas McConkie. Actually, Thomas Worthland McConkie, because he comes from like Mormon apostles on both sides.
Yeah.
And he writes in his book on faith crisis and talks about it in interviews, how he left the Mormon church when he was a teenager, went to China and sought Buddhism, but then he came back and rejoined, or came back into active participation in the church. And the way he talks about it is pretty neat, because he was, of course, shaped by these years and Buddhist beliefs, and he uses that to teach and help others. But what's interesting, and he says that who knows the religious tradition better than you, who were raised into it, and who can change it and evolve it in a positive way better than you if you feel called to do that from the inside. It's not going to be some foreign outsider just coming in and making change.
Right. Yeah, and I also want to validate that for those of you who are staying in religions and trying to make change from the inside, you'll also meet opposition from the inside too.
Oh yeah, that's how it works.
Yeah, plenty of people in the ranks that don't want change to happen.
Yeah. Well, do you want to hear a provocative, evocative poem to wrap things up?
Always, yes, please.
It's a poem about God, by Sheelan Haskin. Susceptibility to Light is what it's called. The worst thing we ever did was put God in the sky, out of reach, pulling the divinity from the leaf, sifting out the holy from our bones, insisting God isn't bursting dazzlement through everything we've made, a hard commitment to see as ordinary, stripping the sacred from everywhere, to put a cloud man elsewhere, prying closeness from your heart. The worst thing we ever did was take the dance and the song out of prayer, made it sit up straight and cross its legs, removed it of rejoicing, wiped clean its hip sway, its questions, its ecstatic yowl, its tears. The worst thing we ever did is pretend God isn't the easiest thing in this universe, available to every soul in every breath.
It's a beautiful poem. Beautiful sentiments. Certainly evocative and provocative for some of our listeners. But that is consistent with my own experience of the divine now. To whatever extent I understand it or experience it, it's in everything. It's in me. It is me. I am it. And by some interpretations, that's actually pretty consistent with my LDS upbringing too.
And many, that God is inside you. God is love.
God is love. If God is anything, my suspicion is God is love. So go out there and be love, folks. And if you have opinions or things to share about today's episode, please send us an email. We'd love to read your responses.
Amen. Good chatting with you about this stuff, Steve.
Amen indeed.
Yeah.
Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinous, a mental wellness company committed to tackling the global mental health crisis by delivering best-in-class psychedelic-assisted therapies, contributing to the body of primary and clinical psychedelic research, and fostering healing through community connection and social responsibility. You can learn more about Numinous at numinous.com. That's Numinus.com. If you enjoyed the show today and you want to support us, here's how you do it. Rate and review the show on platforms like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Subscribe to the Numinous YouTube channel, like the videos, and share it. Share the show or clips of the show with someone that you think will enjoy it. The content of this podcast does not constitute medical advice or mental health treatment. Consult with a medical or mental health professional if you believe you are in need of mental health treatment.